Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Speaker Denny, thank you. Members of the committee, what an honor to be with you. As Ronald Reagan said, this is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times, and so it is. When we're living in an age that we have a federal governing partner that purports to mint trillion-dollar coins to, as a potential solution to severe financial issues, this is as serious as it gets. I'm going to kind of pull this up as he gets going, but to start out with, I want, if you would just kind of imagine, I want to set a framework for what we talk about, and the reason we do that is with the framework, there's no way that we'll talk about everything that goes into this lands issue. We've been hundreds of years getting here, and it's going to take a lot of work to get to a point that we have the ability to get to a situation of education equality, environmental equality, economic self-reliance. But in getting there, I want you to keep this framework in mind, if you would. The reason I'm here is because I have 4 children, and if the slides were working, you would see a nice picture of them. I have a daughter who's 22, and I have a daughter who's 20, and my son is 16, and my youngest is 13. And like you, that's why I got involved in the state legislature. I see things coming down the road that for their future, I wanted to try to secure for them the same rights and blessings that I was privileged to have growing up. Well, let's just suppose that I want to provide for them a foundation in life. And so that when they go start out on their life, I want to have for them a house free and clear. So they have a base of operation. No matter what happens to them, they've got a house paid for. They can go take risks and work and do the things that they want to do, but they've always got a house, a roof over their head. And so as a father, if I wanted to do that and I had the means, there's a legal way of doing that. It's called a trust agreement. Many of you have probably been trustees of a trust. Many of you have probably created your own trusts. If you think of this trust agreement, I'm going to set that up, and Representative Anderson, can I pick on you? So Representative Anderson, I'm going to make you the trustee of my trust, okay? So here are the terms of the trust. It's really simple. When they turn 18, you give them the key. Because I've already provided for the asset. I've already provided for it to be there. And so when my oldest daughter turns 18, you give her the key. And then my next daughter turns 18, and you give her the key. And then the next daughter, my son rather, turns 18, and you give him the key. And then my youngest daughter turns 18, and you give her the key. Pretty simple, right? Well, now, because I'm from Utah, I'm going to have a whole mess of other kids that weren't around when we created this trust agreement. But the trust agreement provided for them as well. The trust agreement said, take care of all these other kids also. And so when they start coming along to turn 18, Representative Anderson gets a bright idea. I told you I was going to pick on you, okay? They turn 18, and Representative Anderson says, you're such a fine young man or young lady. And all they've ever known is that Representative Anderson controls the House. That's all they've ever known, is that he controls the House. And so when they turn 18, he says, you know what I'm going to do for you? I'm going to give you the key to the garage. The garage is good for you. Now, never mind the house is stocked with food, milkshakes flowing out of the tap and all the rest, but we'll give you the key to the garage. And off they go, and as they start to accumulate their stuff and the things that they're doing, it's all got to go in the garage. Now, it doesn't stop there, because Representative Anderson, that's not good enough. He says, I'm even going to tell you now and then what you can do in the garage. Don't think about the rest of the house, but even in the garage that you do have, I'm going to change up what you can use and how, right? Now, that sounds like kind of a silly example, but it fits. It fits with what's happening. If you go back to 1780, there was a trust agreement established over the public lands, over the western territories. And if we had the slides, we'd show you the map that in 1763, you had 13 colonies. And the Crown, when they established those colonies in their colonial charter, said, here's the boundary of your colonies. Now, to 7 of the 13, they said, not only do you have the boundary of your colony, you can claim the western lands. So 7 of the 16 get claims to the western lands. The 6, no claims. They just get the boundary of their colony. So now go from 1763 to 1776. We know what happens, right? They wake up one morning and say, hey, gee, I'm feeling lucky today. Let's pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. And Robert Morris individually puts up the first $2 million to fund the revolution. $2 million in 1776. By 1780, he's tapped out. He dies penniless. But by 1780, he's broke, and they're in the middle of the war. And the British are, you can imagine what the British are doing. Nice try, guys. You should have counted the cost. You should have counted the bricks before you started to build the house. And they're sowing the seeds of dissension, and they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? We're in the middle of this improbable undertaking. And they come up with an idea. The seven say, hey, no problem. We've got this covered. We know how we'll raise money for this. The seven say, we'll just sell some of these western lands. Well, think about the six that don't have claim to the western lands. They've got to go raise taxes, revenue enhancements, whatever we like to call them, right? They're going to raise taxes. Now imagine, we know how this works, right? Particularly if you've ever been on a local government level. You raise taxes here, no raising of taxes there. People are going to vote with their feet. Now, not only that, and the six pointed this out, the six said, not only that, but in case you hadn't noticed, we're all putting our blood and treasure into this revolutionary cause. And so if we're successful, or rather when we're successful, because that's how they thought back then, when we're successful, you're going to end up being these big, huge states, and we're going to be restricted down here. We're not good with that. In fact, in the middle of the revolution, they called this the Great Embarrassment. They were almost at the point of a civil war in the middle of the revolution. I mean, you can imagine what's happening, this struggle that's going on. The Continental Congress stepped up and said, we have an idea. Let us hold the lands. Give the title of the lands to us. And they said, wait a second. In case you hadn't noticed, we're fighting a war against the land baron. It's not going to work?
I think it was too big to email. So
oh, is that right?
That's my guess.
Okay. Can I ask you to do a favor? There is a thumb drive. I don't know how much battery there is left on this. Thumb drive. Is that, do you know how to save a keynote to a PDF? Save the keynote to the PDF, and then we'll just, if we get it, we get it. If we don't, we'll keep going. So, middle of the revolution, 1780, let us hold the lands. They said, wait a minute, we've been fighting a war against the land baron. We don't want to jump from one big centralized land baron to another. You can imagine, right? So I'm going to catch up here so I can give you the quotes. So what happened first of all, in September of 1780, they came up with a resolution that said, let us hold the lands and we'll take care of the lands. They said, no, that's not good enough. If a centralized power is going to hold these lands, you've got to get very, very specific in how we're going to do this. And what their debate was, we'll hold the lands. We'll simply hold the lands as a trustee to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. By holding the lands, we can use them as collateral to fund the war. We'll simply use the lands to pay the debt of the war. In fact, unfortunately, we can't project it up there, but this is the resolution from October 10th of 1780. And by the way, these slides are on the website. They're on the American Lands Council website under the Resources tab, and so you can go back and get the slides, and we can, as a matter of fact, we could probably pull it up from here. Did you get it? I don't know if I have enough battery on this though. Oh, I've got 2 hours. Let's try that. Try that. Okay, we're going to try all kinds of different ways to get there. Let's finish 1780 though, right? So 1780, here's what they say. Be it resolved that the unappropriated lands, which by the way is the same thing we call the lands today, be it resolved that the unappropriated lands that may be ceded or relinquished to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit of the United States and be settled and formed into distinct republican states and shall become members of the Federal Union, having the same rights. Hey, there we go. Well, look at that. We're in business now. Okay. Except that, and maybe that'll make that go away. There we go. I don't know why it looks that way, but we're going to come down here. Go back to here. Oh, look at that. There's your garage right there. Representative Anderson, look what you did to us here. Now, that's not actually my garage, but it probably could be. But Now, on this trust agreement, I'm sorry, I'm just stepping back a second. Thank you for your patience. So stepping back just a second, this just came out this last week. This is a white paper done by Professor Donald Chapman, or not Donald Chapman, Donald Cochin of Chapman University School of Law, that just came out this week. He describes this whole trust relationship, the legal, the historical, the constitutional underpinnings of this trust agreement, this duty to dispose that Representative Anderson took on to deliver the key. That analogy holds. So anyway, that's available on the website. You've got copies in front of you of that. We're going to produce a 3 to 5 page executive summary I should have out this week, and we'll get that out to you as well. So here's the map that we were talking about, okay? Is it okay if I wander around here, or do I need to be close to this? Need to get over to that? We'll try to keep there. So here's the map we were talking about. You had the 7 of the 16, the western lands. So of the 7, they had claims to the western lands. The 6 didn't. And they said, so here we go. Be it resolved, the unappropriated lands that shall be ceded or relinquished to the United States by any of the particular states shall be disposed of for the common benefit of the United States. That means pay the debt of the war. And shall be settled and formed into distinct republican states having the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as the other states. And the lands shall be granted and settled under such regulations as hereafter agreed by Congress assembled. The trust agreement. In fact, what you'll see as we go forward, the courts repeatedly, the states repeatedly, Congress repeatedly referred to this agreement as the trust agreement. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. They win the war. Improbably, they win the war. Now, they're in charge of what they do with these lands. You can imagine when the states compromise their claims to the western lands to be able to pay the debt and form new states, now they've won the war and they're trying to wonder what do they do with these claims. They asked Thomas Jefferson to draft the land ordinance, and in 1784 in the land ordinance, Thomas Jefferson drafts and says this: in no case shall the states interfere with the primary disposal. Remember, going back to 1780, that was the duty, dispose of the lands. The states won't interfere with the primary disposal of the soil by the United States, nor with any ordinances or regulations which Congress may find necessary for securing title in the soil to bona fide purchasers, and the states will be admitted on an equal footing. Equal footing always pertained to the creation of states being on that same status, having the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, independence as all the other states. 1787, now we're ready to start creating new states. We're going to create these states out of the Northwest Territory, northwest of the river, the Ohio River. That's what they called the territory at the time. You'll recall that Canada was out there. We were looking at having part of Canada where all of it becomes states. The Orleans Territory was out there. We thought that that may at some point become a state. The territory they talked about was this Northwest Territory. And out of that, they were at the point of creating new states. Their enabling act is called the Northwest Ordinance. And in the Northwest Ordinance, which was done in July of 1787, they say this: for the establishment of states and their admission to share in the federal councils on an equal footing with the original states, and that the legislatures of those new states shall never interfere with the primary disposal, going back to the duty in 1780, or with any regulations for securing title in the soil to bona fide purchasers. Now, 1 month later, in August of 1787 now, you've got Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention going side by side. In fact, some of the people were going back and forth. Hamilton went back and forth almost every day. And so in 1780, they're drafting the Constitution. They get to Article 4, Section 3. And in the constitutional debate, there's 1 page of constitutional debate on this subject. And they say that this section, Article 4, Section 3, is simply to preserve the status quo with respect to the western lands. Well, what does that mean? What is the status quo with respect to the western lands in August of 1787? It's the trust agreement in 1780. It's the land ordinance in 1784. It's the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Dispose of the land to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt, and no other use or purpose whatsoever. Let me back up just a second. In 1780, when they did that trust agreement, New York was the first state. New York said, okay, based on that, that's good enough now. You've taken a solemn compact, a solemn undertaking to only hold title to those lands as a trustee to dispose to create new states. So in 1780, New York disposed of its lands. It ceded its lands to the United States in a deed of cession that said, create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. 3 other states ceded their lands by similar deeds before the Constitution was ratified. 3 of the states, however, didn't cede their lands until after the Constitution was ratified. Georgia didn't cede its lands to the United States until 1802. Why is that important? Well, it shows that that trust agreement was valid and binding not just before the Constitution, but after the Constitution, because Georgia, based on that 1780 trust agreement, said the same thing. We're ceding our western lands to you, United States, create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. So now we get to Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution. This is critical. This is absolutely critical to understand, because this is where Congress gets power to do anything with respect to these western lands. So remember, in the constitutional debate, one page, they say this is simply to preserve that status quo. Look at what it says. Congress shall have the power to dispose of. That's the power that was granted. Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Think about what that means. In law school, they don't teach you what this is. You don't learn about this. In law school, in fact, today they'll tell you that make needful rules and regulations means Congress can do whatever it wants. Does that make any sense? Dispose of the land, make needful rules and regulations, and not prejudice any claims. The claims, the states compromised their claims in 1780 in order to promote the war and to pay the debt and create new states. The United States had a claim on those lands to pay the debt. Those were the claims that they were not to prejudice by this section. If you think about it for just a second, where the federal government now claims that this means they have the power to do whatever they want without limitation, does that make any sense at all? When you go back into, this is Article 4. I happened to be in Washington several times over the last few months, but I was there in June, and we went to the National Archives. And when you go to the National Archives and you see the Constitution laid out in those big parchments, you see Article 1 written in one parchment. That Article 1 is the powers and the checks of Congress. And then you see Article 2, and Article 2 is the powers and the checks of the President. And Article 3 are the powers and the checks of the courts. And Article 4, the rights of and obligations to the states. It was laid out for a purpose that way. So in Article 4, which is the rights of and obligations to the states, it says Congress has the power to dispose of and make needful rules and regulations. Now over in Article 1, that is the rights and powers of Congress, it says Congress can hold property. It can. Congress can hold property if it's the District of Columbia for the seat of government, and if they buy the property with the consent of the legislature, and it's for forts, batteries, dockyards, arsenals, and other needful buildings. So in the article of the Constitution that's about the powers of Congress, they have the power to hold property. Over here in the section of the Constitution that is the rights of and obligations to the states, it says Congress has the power to dispose. And there's so much more that we could talk about in that, but again, it's on the website, and there's a lot more. But when you think about reading those together, it has the power to dispose and make needful rules and regulations, and it's consistent with that trust agreement going back. Now, actually, I think I'm going to skip that and move forward and come back to that. So you think about that. Congress had this duty to dispose. Well, there came a time when the western states got fed up with the fact that it wasn't disposing, that it looked like this. I mean, look at that. That map by itself is the greatest argument of the absurdity of this. It's not just an east-west even. Look at Hawaii. The federal government disposed of the land to Hawaii. It's not east-west. It's not by time. California was made a state long before Oklahoma. You and North Dakota were made states less than a year apart. You're about 9 months apart with North Dakota. They have 3% federal land. You have 63%. And the promises at statehood are the same. So it's just this arbitrary thing. Now, there came a time when the western states got fed up with this. And they said, look, you're not disposing of the land like you promised. We can't tax the land to educate our children. We can't grow our economy and provide good paying jobs, and you're hoarding all of our abundant resources and minerals. Does that sound familiar? That was in 1828. In 1828, the western states, by their own admission, the western states were Florida and Indiana and Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. They were the western states. Louisiana, I don't know if I mentioned that one. They were the western states. And look at them today. Illinois was 90% federally controlled for decades. Missouri was 90% federally controlled for decades. These other states, Florida said, we're the worst off of all the western states. So it's already been done. Isn't it critical then, if this has already been done, their land was controlled, 90% of their land was controlled for decades, and they succeeded. Isn't it important to know, what did they do? Well, they knew their history. They knew this public land's history. They knew their rights. They banded together, and they simply refused to take no for an answer. In fact, they sent, and we'll look at some of these right now, but they sent resolution after resolution, delegation after delegation. Every communication contact they had with Washington, they said, when are you going to keep your promise so we can educate our children? When are you going to keep your promise so our people don't flee our state and go to places like North Dakota where they've got 20,000 jobs just waiting for people? When are you going to keep your promise so that we can provide for our own economic self-reliance? And every communication they had with Washington, they would make that point. This is some of the things that came out of that. So they finally got to the point that they had congressional hearings. And this is in the Congressional Public Lands Committee in their report. Look at what they say. If these lands are withheld from sale, in vain may the people of these states expect the advantages of well-settled neighborhoods so essential to the education of our youth. Those states will, for many generations, without some change, be retarded in their endeavors to increase their comfort and wealth, because they have not the power incident to all sovereign states of taxing the soil to pay for the benefits conferred upon the owners. Think about that for a second. They have not the power incident to all sovereign states. If you're a sovereign state, you have the power of taxing. If you don't have the power of taxing, you're something other than a sovereign state, is what the Congressional Public Lands Committee said back then when they were discussing this. When these states stipulated not to tax the lands of the United States until they were sold, they rested upon the implied engagement of Congress to cause them to be sold within a reasonable time. I want to stop right there for just a second. If you've got, if you happen to have a Constitution, you may want to mark this. Article 6, Clause 1 in your Constitution. This kind of gets overlooked, but Article 6, Clause 1 says, all debts contracted and engagements, notice the word they used, it rested upon the implied engagement of Congress to cause them to be sold within a reasonable time. All debts and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. Remember the trust agreement of 1780? All engagements entered into before are valid and binding after. The Congressional Public Lands Committee knew this in 1828, and that's what they were talking about. No just equivalent has been given those states for a surrender of an attribute of sovereignty so important to their welfare and an equal standing with the original states. Again, taxing the soil is an attribute of sovereignty. If you don't have the right to tax the soil within the boundaries of your state, you're something other than a sovereign state, is what the Congressional Public Lands Committee was saying in 1828. I love that last line. A remedy for such great evils. For once I can say I completely agree with Congress. A remedy for such great evils is found in simply carrying into effect the spirit of the federal Constitution, which knows of no inequality in the powers and the rights of the several states. This is just representative. Now on the website, you'll find original documents of the resolutions of these states, original other statements of Congressional Public Lands Committee reports on the website. This is just representative, one resolution from Missouri. They sent several. They didn't just send one resolution and say, there, we've told them what we think. They sent resolution after resolution and delegation after delegation. We can't educate our children. We're below the national average in per pupil funding. We can't increase because we don't have the base. Repeatedly, the arguments, if you read, particularly the Illinois, you want to read the Illinois resolution, it's beautiful, but they make the arguments, the same arguments we have today, so much more eloquently than we do now. But this is Missouri. The present condition of the western states, right? The state of Missouri never could have been brought to consent not to tax the lands of the United States while unsold, and not to tax the lands sold until 5 years thereafter. That was the deal. That was the reasonable time they talked about. If it had been understood by the contracting parties that a system was to be pursued which would prevent 9/10 of those lands from ever becoming property of persons in whose hands they might be taxed. Again, there's more resolutions on the website. These are just some representative samples. So it's already been done. Critical point number one. This has already been done. We're not blazing new territory. We're simply looking at what's already happened by Illinois, by Missouri, by Louisiana, by Florida. to secure education equality for their children, to secure economic self-reliance for their state. Now, I want to use well, I'll use you as an example with them, but on the right is the Enabling Act of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. It's actually the same document. It's not just the same, it's not just the same language. They actually have one document that is the Enabling Act for all 4 states. On the left is Utah's, but Idaho's language that you adopted into your Constitution is the same. It's the same language. Now, think about this. You and North Dakota are 9 months apart. You have the same language, operative language in your statehood. They have 3% federally controlled land. You have 63%. Now, here's the language, and some people will point to this. The first part of the sentence says, the people inhabiting said state propose and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. Have you heard that before? People will throw that out and say, you got no case. Ivory, what are you talking about? Look right there. It says you disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands. Well, you'll notice, perhaps, and I'm sorry it's so small, but again, it's on the website, there's no period there. There's a comma. There's a comma. The rest of the sentence says, until title thereto shall be extinguished. When Representative Anderson is going to be the trustee of my trust, what's the first thing that I do so that he can control that house? I sign over a quitclaim, and that property sits in the name of Representative Anderson. Now, he's bound by the terms of the trust, but the title's in his name. Same thing. Supreme Court has said that over and over again. Congress has said that over and over again. Yes, we did disclaim title. We cleared title so that when the federal government disposed, as it was duty-bound to dispose, when it extinguished, as it was duty-bound to extinguish, the recipients would have good, clean, clear title. That's what that's about. In fact, again, the Supreme Court has said that repeatedly, and I'll show you another document that goes to that. But, oh, actually, let me back up now to this. Go here. So this is Andrew Jackson, okay? In 1833, Andrew Jackson vetoes a bill that passed both houses of Congress. The national debt was paid off in 1830. Imagine that. It was the only time in our history we had no national debt. Because we had no national debt, Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, had a bright idea. He said, we have to dispose of the land. That's indisputable. He said this on the floor of the Senate. This is the great national public trust. We have to dispose of these lands. But since the debt is paid off, when we dispose of the land, we'll take the money and hold that in a pot in Congress. And when the states and counties do what we want, we'll give them some money. Does that sound familiar? Right? The bill passes the House, it passes the Senate, it runs into Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson vetoes the bill. And in vetoing the bill, he does a veto statement that, again, is also on the website under the Resources tab. I would recommend that you read it. It's about 8 or 9 pages. It's a beautiful, brilliant statement. It's the most contemporaneous, concise, first-person history of this public land trust. Now, you'll notice Andrew Jackson was born in 1767. By 1787, when Article 4 of the Constitution was drafted, he was a 20-year-old. But he wasn't a 20-year-old by today's standards in the basement playing video games. He was already a lawyer practicing law in Tennessee. Tennessee was yet to be a state. He lived in this area concerned about what happens to states that are yet to be states. He was a military officer in the Orleans Territory. Again, not yet a state. He spent his life and career in these areas that were yet to be states. And so Andrew Jackson, that has this firsthand knowledge of this Western territory and the compact and the covenants, had this to say. He said, it's the real interest of each and all the states in the Union, and particularly the new states, that the price of these lands shall be reduced and graduated, and that after they've been offered for a certain number of years, the refuse remaining unsold shall be abandoned to the states, and the machinery of our land system entirely withdrawn. What would that look like today? It can't be supposed that the compacts intended the United States should forever retain a title to lands in the states which are of no value, and no doubt it is entertained that the general interest, the interest of the entire nation, would best be promoted by surrendering such lands to the states. I mean, this was and again, the Supreme Court and others repeatedly affirmed the same thing that Andrew Jackson was saying. So in 1854, because the states knew their rights, knew their history, banded together and refused to take no for an answer, by 1854 they prevailed upon Congress to pass what was called the Graduated Price Act. The Graduated Price Act said they're going to reduce the price of every acre by 1/4 an acre. In the 1820s, they said every acre is $1.25. We don't care if it's down by the river. We don't care if it's sagebrush territory. Every acre's $1.25, because that's how the federal government manages property. So you can imagine the good stuff down by the river sold like that. The rest of it sat and sat and sat, and Illinois was 90% federally controlled, and Missouri and the rest of it. Well, so the Graduated Price Act said we're going to reduce the price of the lands $0.25 an acre every year until it finally is down to zero. We'll just give it to the states, which is why Illinois has 3% federally controlled land, and Missouri and the rest of them. But it was only by continuing to apply that political persuasion, even threatening litigation, even worse if you read some of their resolutions. That was back when men were men and states were states. They said, you're going to keep your promise, or else. It's in great language. The Illinois resolution, you need to read it. It's beautiful language, what they said. But they were serious. They refused to take no for an answer. Now, here's what some people say about this. These are the four myths. These are what people say as to why you can't do this. We already talked about the first one. The first myth is you just gave up title to your land. You just didn't want it. You didn't want all that timber. You'd rather burn it up, right? You didn't want all that silver. You didn't want all that gold. You didn't want all those minerals. You didn't want all that oil. You didn't want it. You wanted to try to educate and manage your land and health, safety, welfare, sanitation, police, and fire, with some counties having as much as 3% taxable land. That's the argument, right? And they point to that disclaim language, forever disclaim all right and title. Well, guess what? Louisiana has the same language in their Enabling Act, forever disclaim all right and title. Mississippi, Alabama, same language, forever disclaim all right and title of the unappropriated public lands until title thereto shall have been extinguished. Promises are the same. And yet they say somehow we gave it up. The second one is you can't manage these lands. I really like that one. You can't manage these lands. You know, I'm going to show you some photos in just a second. You know what you were dealing with this summer. Hundreds of thousands of acres burned because you can't touch a tree. Tens of millions of animals scorched because you can't enter upon the land and manage it. Air quality, watershed decimated for decades because you can't enter upon those lands. We can't manage our lands? I'm sure if your state forester were here, as we had in our committee, we had our land managers, our school trust land managers, we had our state park managers, our forest managers come before our natural resources committee and said, tell us the difference. And they actually brought photos and said, well, here's what happens when the fire ravages through a federal forest and it gets to state lands. It drops to the ground and goes out because this is how we manage state lands. I've got some reports I can give you on that, but Arkansas and Missouri can manage their lands and Idaho and Utah can't? Doesn't make sense. The second one is, well, these lands belong to all of us, is one of the arguments. They just belong to all of us. Well, think about that for a second. Why the arbitrary line where all of a sudden these lands belong to all of us? Hawaii doesn't. But these lands here do, but the lands east of Colorado don't, when the promises are the same. Does that make any sense? And if the promises are the same, and they are, then they either need to give their lands back or they need to keep their promise with us. And then the last one is they say, well, this is just clearly unconstitutional. We don't even need to talk about it. It's just clearly unconstitutional. Well, again, the promises are the same. It's already been done. You've got the white paper in front of you that addresses very squarely the constitutional foundation of the federal government's duty to dispose. But here's just a few excerpts. In 1980, there was a case in the Supreme Court. They called these Enabling Acts solemn compacts, bilateral agreements to be performed in a timely fashion. The federal government holds the territorial lands in trust for the states ultimately to be created. That was in 1894, right at the time of our Enabling Act, just slightly after yours. Another case that talked about these principles, that once the federal government has executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the new states will be complete, and they and the original states will be on an equal footing in all respects. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil, except for temporary purposes, to execute the trusts. 1932. After we were made a state, you were made a state, Arizona, New Mexico, in 1912. And we're starting to say, come on, guys, get on with it. And the argument was, well, it's harder in your states. And that was a true statement. Your land is more arid, it's more rugged, it's harder to dispose of. True statement. But by 1932, our states stood up and said, come on, guys, you got to keep your promise. So much so that President Hoover convened a presidential commission, which led to congressional hearings. And notice the caption on the congressional hearings. There were hearings on granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. Not if, only how. Now, there were three proposals. One of the proposals was, let's just get on with it and give the land to the states. The other two proposals were, we'll give you the surface rights and we'll keep all the minerals. You can imagine all of the governors and the land managers and the senators from the western states stood up and said, yeah, that doesn't work for us. You need to keep your whole promise. You need to give us the benefits and the burdens together. But even in 1932, they recognized this duty to dispose was uncontested. And yet somehow we've been convinced today that somehow it's just supposed to be that way. This part is red and this part is white, but Hawaii's not. No, the duty to dispose was unmistakable and uncontested. Until we get to 1976. In 1976, we run into the Federal Land Policy Management Act, where Congress for the first time says it's now our policy to simply retain these lands in federal ownership. So on the one hand, you've got Constitution, you've got a trust, you've got a solemn compact, you've got a bilateral agreement of statehood between sovereigns, and on the other hand, you've got a policy. Does that make any sense? Well, fortunately, the Supreme Court dealt with that about 3 years ago, which is what opened the legal door to so much of our analysis. In this case, Hawaii versus the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, unanimous Supreme Court case about 3 years ago. The United States Supreme Court was dealing with Hawaii and their Enabling Act and the lands that were granted to them at statehood, and there was a subsequent resolution by Congress that had to deal with apologizing to the Native Hawaiians for how their lands were taken away and then given back to the state of Hawaii. In the apology resolution, it says, you know, whereas, now therefore, we apologize to the Native Hawaiians for your land being taken away from you, and nothing in this apology resolution will deny or disparage any claims that you have against the federal government. Well, a few years after that apology resolution, the state of Hawaii went to sell some of its lands. And the Native Hawaiians, represented by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, came in and said, wait, you can't do that. This policy, this resolution of Congress, this subsequent act of Congress, changed those rights. They said, you have to impress a lien upon those lands because that apology resolution said none of our rights will be disparaged as against the federal government. They went to Hawaiian District Court, and Hawaiian District Court said, that subsequent act doesn't bind the state of Hawaii with respect to its rights at statehood. It goes to the Hawaiian Supreme Court, and the Hawaiian Supreme Court says, oh yeah, that does. That does. You have to impress those lands with a lien based on this subsequent action of Congress from your Enabling Act. It goes to the United States Supreme Court. And on that basis, the United States Supreme Court says the consequences of a state's admission are instantaneous. It ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress, like FLTMA, can diminish what was already bestowed. And that proposition applies with even greater force where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. That opened the door. That's what led us down this inquiry as we started moving on this adventure of how do we try to close these gaps. In Utah, we have a $2 billion per year education funding gap. We're $2 billion a year below average. I'll show you in just a second the dependency that we've got on the federal government. This is amazing. This is John Kenneth Galbraith, world-renowned economist. This was back in about the mid-'80s. He said, where socialized ownership of land is concerned, only the USSR and China can claim company with the United States. Now, since he said that, China and the former USSR have been liberalizing private control of land because they know that's how you produce prosperity. We've been centralizing control of land even more in the United States. So this is where we are. So it's been done before, the promises are the same, and this is the only solution big enough. I'm sure you all had your Sweet 16 party when we crashed through $16 trillion in national debt, and that's just the official debt, right? I mean, beyond the official debt, well, we'll get to, I don't know if I have those in there. Beyond the official debt, the latest figures that we have now from the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, that if you calculated the deficit on an accrual basis, as we do in our books, the annual deficit is in excess of $7 trillion a year. When you account for the promises made for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid for which there is not money to provide for those promises, accounting on an accrual basis, just as we do in our businesses, in our states, and our counties, the annual deficit is greater than $7 trillion a year. This is Idaho, okay? And this comes from the Clifton Larson Allen report, Intergovernmental Dependency. $3.3 billion of the funds that Idaho spends. Now, what we spend and what we budget are sometimes different things. But $3.3 billion out of $7.9 is Idaho's dependency on federal funds. 42.1%. Now take heart, because in Utah we're 45.3%, so you're way better than us. 40%, 40 cents of every dollar we spend. 40 cents of every dollar we spend comes from a federal government that now borrows or prints more than 45 cents of every dollar that it sends down the line. And imagine in your business that 40% of your revenue comes from a single source that you know is unsustainable. Not a promising business plan, but that's where we are. So there's our looming budget holes. Let's see if we can get this in here. This is from Erskine Bowles. After the 2008 meltdown, President Obama appointed Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson to be the co-chairs of his Fiscal Responsibility Commission to study what happened in the 2008 meltdown and what's coming and what do we do about it. So they studied this for more than a year, and then they gave their presentation to the Senate Budget Committee on March 8th, 2011. This is almost 2 years ago, so pay attention to the time frames that Erskine Bowles talks about in this.
A lot of us sitting in this room didn't see this last crisis as it came upon us, but this one is really easy to see. The fiscal path we are on today is simply not sustainable. This debt and these deficits that we are incurring on an annual basis are like a cancer, and they are truly going to destroy this country from within unless we have the common sense to do something about it. This is a problem we're going to have to face up to in maybe 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But if our bankers over there in Asia begin to believe that we're not going to be solid on our debt, that we're not going to be able to meet our obligations, just stop and think for a minute what happens if they just stop buying our debt. What happens to interest rates? And what happens to the U.S. economy? The markets will absolutely devastate us if we don't step up to this problem. The problem is real, the solutions are painful, and we have to act.
What I tell people is very simple, and people in America are way ahead of all of you. They know what's going on, because when you say, why don't you go back and think of what people are doing at their kitchen table? I'll tell you what they're doing at their kitchen table. They know that if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And they know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And they've got it figured out that this government is stupid. To borrow 40 cents for every buck you spend, forget the charts, forget the GDP, all the rest of it. That's where we are.
I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. Let me just tell you how crazy our situation is today. We have this treaty where we're supposed, if China were to attack Taiwan, we're supposed to support Taiwan. The only problem is we'd have to borrow the money from China in order to do it. This is a real mess we're in today. And we can either take the ostrich theory and put our heads in the sand, or we can decide we're going to step up and do something about it. But I can tell you, bankers aren't going to continue to finance something that they aren't sure they're going to get paid back. And the less sure they are, the more they're going to charge you at first, and then they're going to cut you off. And we're borrowing half of our money from foreign countries.
I mean, we could talk about that for quite a while, but I had one of our TV stations call me up for an interview after this mint the $1 trillion coin thing came out, and they said, what do you think? And I said, what do I think? Seriously? What do I think? I mean, this is desperation. This is desperation. Some Representative Cox and some other former congressmen looking at this, and there are many different estimates and looking at the numbers, but we're somewhere north of $85 trillion in obligations if the federal government did its books the way we do in our state. Now, no matter what the federal government does, we've artificially put interest rates at zero. China's not buying our bonds anymore. They're net selling. Japan, you know what kind of shape Japan's in. Japan's not buying our bonds anymore. They're in the position of having to liquidate. And yet we've put interest rates at zero artificially because we're printing $85 billion a month to buy our own debt. You know, I wish we could laugh about it, but it's so serious because we still have to educate children. We still have to take care of public safety and sanitation and roads and all the rest. Take care of sick people and poor people, no matter what happens in Washington. And yet 40 cents of every dollar we spend comes from that. So this is about economic self-reliance. This is Utah. Commissioner Schmelik from Idaho County did an op-ed that I believe is in your packet that talked about the revenue from timber in Idaho, and I should have put that in. But Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, this is the Government Accountability Office, more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming than the rest of the world combined, locked up in federally controlled lands. This was 5 months ago. The amount of revenue that you're burning up, just literally burning up, minerals that you can't access, and yet our children are among the worst funded on a per pupil basis in the United States in the West because we don't have that base to increase revenue and you know, then with the uncertainties coming forward. So, you know, like this, we've got the resources if we have the will. This is, on the top is wildfires greater than 250 acres, and on the bottom is the federally managed lands. You're finding a coincidence there, I guess, right? This came out about 5 months ago. This is the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security criminal activity alert. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in their Inspire magazine. That's what they call their terrorism magazine. Isn't that nice? In their Inspire magazine, they encourage the use of wildfires as a form of jihad. In other documents that I've been able to obtain, what they're publicizing throughout their terrorism network is that they can take wild horses and tie a flare to their tail and turn them loose. And they'll randomly go throughout the forest and take all of that fuel that we built up because we can't touch trees in the forest and do billions of dollars worth of damage for a few $100s. Now, not only the damage to the forest, you've dealt with the air quality issues. In fact, by some studies coming out of Montana and elsewhere, 20 times more mercury than all the coal-fired power plants combined from wildfires. We're killing tens of millions of animals. In fact, I'll get to that, but this is their map. This is Al-Qaeda's map on what they're targeting because we've given them the fuel load because we can't treat the forest. You know, healthy forest, 40 to 50 trees per acre. Right now, they're somewhere in the 900 to 1,000 trees per acre range, and then it decimates the watershed for generations. So this is right here, this summer, right? This sheep fire. We don't like to look at these things, but this is what's happening. Tens of millions of animals. In fact, this is Utah now, protected species even that are burning up in these fires. So it's about education equality, it's about economic self-reliance, it's about environmental quality, it's about wildlife preservation, because those whose lives and livelihoods depend upon the land we live here are going to be more responsive and responsible than an absentee, centralized landlord that's broke. And that's just common sense. In fact, the facts bear it out, and I can send you studies and reports on that as well. But so this is what my grandma's chickens looked like when I was a young man. I'm positive. I'm sure that's what they look like. That's how I remember them. And my grandma would send me out to get the eggs, and they were just mean. They would just peck and go. It scared me. I'm a little boy. But about 4 or 5 years ago, my wife and I got chickens. And it came time to go get the eggs, and I'm putting the armor on to go get the eggs from the chickens. And this is what my chickens look like. And I went out to get the eggs, and they're like, what? And I'm like, you know, sneaking up, and they're like, dude, what's up? I grabbed the eggs and go, and I was a little disappointed that I didn't have to, you know, use my big courage because I'm this big, strong guy now. I actually went back to the cow ranch store, and I said, something's wrong with the chickens. And they said, what? I said, they don't peck. He said, oh, yeah, we bred that out of them. We bred that out of them. It's already been done before. by the likes of Illinois and Missouri and Indiana and Arkansas and Louisiana back before the peck was bred out of them. This is the bill, okay? Based on the Supreme Court case in the Hawaii versus Office of Hawaiian Affairs and so many others, and what's laid out in this white paper that lays out the legal constitutional case so effectively, which is what we put, by the way, in the bill. We ran a bill and then we ran a resolution as a companion to the bill. The resolution taught this history and laid out the legal case and the framework, and so we ran the resolution with the bill. So what the bill does is it establishes a deadline. My daughter came home from school. She's a junior now at Utah State. And she came home and she says, "Dad, I got a problem." I said, "You know what, sweetheart?" She says, "I buy food, I put it in the refrigerator, my roommates eat it. And then I put my name all over it, I buy more food, I put my name all over it, I put it in the refrigerator, and my roommates eat it." She says, "Dad, what do I do?" I said, "Honey, you've got a couple choices, don't you? You can buy more food and they're going to eat it, or you can sit down and have a difficult conversation with your roommates." Well, that's what HB 148 does. It's time to have a difficult conversation with our governing partner. They made a promise, the same promise to us as they did to all the states east of Colorado. It's time to keep that promise because, in case they hadn't noticed, we're in an economically tremendous situation, and we still need to educate our children and provide for public safety and take care of sick people, poor people, and transportation. And so we need to have that difficult conversation. As in anything, when you're in a situation of a negotiation and someone else is controlling the property, well, delay becomes a tactic. "Yeah, we'll get back to you. Yeah, we'll think about that." So we set a deadline. That's the first thing that HB 148 does. It sets a deadline of December 31st of 2014. We set it out far enough to have a meaningful opportunity to work with our governing partner on an orderly transfer of the public lands, to keep their promise to us. Now, what it also does is it sets up in our Constitutional Defense Council to prepare legislation of the uniquely sovereign acts. Remember, that's the language from the Supreme Court in 2009. The uniquely sovereign character of a state's admission, the uniquely sovereign acts that we will take in the event that they won't work with us. We don't need to set that now because we're still banking on working with them on an orderly transfer, particularly as we get more states working together. By the way, remind me to tell you about New Mexico and Nevada and Arizona and others before we finish here. They all have bills moving forward. National parks are off the table. Indian lands off the table. Military lands off the table. National monuments off the table. Congressionally designated wilderness off the table. We're not talking about those. By our choice. We still preserve in Utah an area about the size of West Virginia as open space. Now, in addition to that, we establish in the bill to set up and form the Utah Public Lands Commission to manage for the multiple use and sustain yield with local planning these lands. That was the promise that FLTMA made, but then also failed. FLTMA promised multiple use, sustain yield, local planning, and you know what's happened with your RMPs, and you know what's happened with local planning and multiple use, and I'm assuming it's very similar to what's happening in Utah. But put very simply, federal public lands become state public lands to be managed for the multiple use, sustain yield with local planning. This is who we are. If we were in 1896 in Utah's case, and it's what, 1890 for Idaho, was it? 1890, right? If we were at 1890, yeah, sell off all the lands. That was the deal back then. But we're 100 years down the road relying on hunting and fishing and open space and access and recreation and grazing. That's who we've become, and we've developed our culture and our way of life and our statehood around that 100-year reliance on that. So dispose of the land to the state. By the way, there are precedents for that. Hawaii, they gave all the land to the state. Michigan, they started to dispose of the land privately, and they said, we don't want to deal with this. You take 14 million acres and you just deal with it. Tennessee, they gave all the land to the state to dispose of it. There are precedents for that. But so dispose of it to the state so that we can continue to manage our well-being in our state. Federal public lands become state public lands, managed for multiple use, sustain yield with local planning. If the state were to determine to sell any lands. Imagine right now, if a city or a county wanted to sell a road or a park, they can do it. In statute, they can do it. It's very difficult. There's a very heightened scrutiny of procedure to do it. Typically, first thing you do is you have to have a hearing to vacate the public use. And so you have a hearing just to determine whether or not this should still be a public use or not. Assuming you clear that hurdle, then you have a second hearing on the terms of sale. Similar kind of procedure would be at play in what we're envisioning in Utah. But if we do sell land, 5% of the proceeds go to our permanent fund for education. That's right in our Enabling Act, right in our statehood contract. 95% goes to the federal government to pay the national debt. Again, that comes right out of our Enabling Act contract. So that, the idea then with controlling the land, let's compare North Dakota to Idaho to Utah. It's even more stark, North Dakota with Idaho, because you were made a state the same year. North Dakota gets 100% of their mineral royalty. North Dakota controls access on their lands. When I was with one of my dear friends, a representative in North Dakota, she's just giddy all the time. She says, we have so much money to educate our kids. We have so much money for roads. In fact, they even proposed removing their property tax. They didn't do it because they were afraid, what if something happens down the road, we want to still have this ability to tax. But then when I talked to her, I'm like, Betty, you know, thanks for letting us know. And she'll apologize. I said, no, Betty, we just want to be like you when we grow up. We just want them to keep the same promise to us. And so that's the bill. Now, I want to propose to you something. Imagine if John Calipari in the national championship game had huddled up his Kentucky Wildcats, and he said to him before the game in his speech, he says, fellas, here's what we're going to do. We're going to play the best defense that any college basketball team has ever played in the history of college basketball. We're just going to tear them up on defense, but we're never going to cross that center line. We've been playing defense for 50, 60, 70 years. And we get more and more and more intrusions on the right and control and access of our land, and we keep playing defense. Well, what HB 148, what the Transfer of Public Lands Act does is it goes on offense. Because we swore a duty, constitutionally, to protect the lives, liberties, and properties of our people. We're in a situation now with this budget situation that we're going to have to figure out how to educate our children and provide for these other essential public services where we're already reliant 40% on a federal government that is unfortunately broke. I wish it weren't the case, but that's where we are. So I don't know if any of you know, if you follow the Utah Jazz at all, but second from the right is Hot Rod Hundley. He's the voice of the Utah Jazz, or was until he retired recently. I think he's still going, as a matter of fact. But Hot Rod Hundley played basketball, college, and pro with Wilt Chamberlain. And when he speaks on the circuit sometimes, Rod will get up and he'll say, you know, Wilt and I, we combined one night to score 52 points to win the game. And if you say, well, Rod, how many points did you score? He said, that doesn't matter. And if you work on him, say, Rod, come on, how many points did you score? I say, well, yeah, I scored 2 points. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. In our system of government that is a republic of republics of republics, we have those jurisdictional giants that step up to protect the life, liberty, and property of their people. That's why governments were instituted among men, right? Those jurisdictional giants that we all score our 2 points and throw the ball to jurisdictional giants to protect these things, even if they're hard. I want to just kind of close up with some of this. This is 5 months ago. This is in the Affordable Care Act decision. I was in Washington, D.C. when this decision came out. In fact, I was standing right in front of the Supreme Court. I wasn't there for that, but I'm there when the decision came out. And so I was awake all night reading the decision. And in the morning when the news came on, we turned it on, and the news media were saying, oh, well, Justice Roberts turned on his principles. Justice Roberts caved. And when I woke up, I was talking to my traveling companion and said, I think Justice Roberts was a genius in what he did. Look at his language. Let me give you an example to just kind of set the stage. I'm going to pick on you again, Representative Anderson, because you're just so easy to, you're right there. And, do you have children? Let's go back to when they were like, 10, 12, 13, somewhere in there, right? Now, this probably never happened in your home, I'm guessing, but you get the, Dad, he's looking at me. He's touching me. She's breathing my air, right? And they come to you and they say, Dad, solve my problem. What happens if you solve their problem? They keep doing it. And when they have another problem, they're going to come to Dad. And they're going to come to Dad next week and next month and next year and next decade and the decade after that. And finally, someday they're going to come to Dad and say, Dad, could we be an adult maybe now? And Dad's finally going, would you please, right? I think what Justice Roberts is saying here is to the states and those that have jurisdiction, grow up. Look at this. Federal government's expanded dramatically over the past 2 centuries, but it still must show that a constitutional grant of power authorizes each of its actions. The same does not apply to the states, because the Constitution is not the source of their power. State governments do not need constitutional authorization to act. Our cases, for over 200 years, refer to this general power of governing possessed by the states, but not the federal government, as the police power, the power to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their people. The framers ensured that the powers which in the ordinary course concern the lives and the liberties and the properties of the people were held by governments more local and more accountable than a distant federal bureaucracy. This is the Supreme Court 5 months ago, guys. The independent power of the states serves as a check on the power of the federal government. The independent power of the states, what's that? The independent, that's not Mother May I, Representative Anderson. Thank you for letting me pick on you here. It's not Mother May I or Pretty Please. The independent power of the states serves as a check on the power of the federal government. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism, governing partnership, right? Not subordinate subdivision, not you have the liberty to do what we tell you to do, governing partners in a governing partnership, which was the most unprecedented aspect of our Constitution. Federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary federal power, is what they're talking about. It protects the liberty of farmers to farm, and builders to build, and loggers to log, and miners to mine, and teachers to teach from arbitrary federal power. That's the system that we have. And I love this. This is kind of the money quote on what they said. The Supreme Court again. In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. The federal policies, like the Federal Land Policy Management Act, for example, when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. States are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. I believe that's what Justice Roberts was saying, what the Supreme Court was saying. It's time to grow up. It's time to grow up in our system and be what we're supposed to be. We have not only the right, but the obligation to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our people. I'll go just quickly. This is what we learn in school, that is checks and balances, but this is our system. James Madison in Federalist 51 said that in a single republic, the checks are between branches. But in the compound, this is Federalist 51, in the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is divided among two distinct governments, and they control each other as a double security to the rights of the people. And in fact, in Federalist 45, Madison went on to say that the balance of power between those two governments, few and defined, and numerous and indefinite. That's what our system of government was designed to be. And yet, because we don't perhaps, well, jurisdiction that we don't understand or exercise is no better for our people than jurisdiction we don't have. And so it may end up looking something like this instead. Let me just finish with this. John Dickinson was in the constitutional debate known as the Pennsylvania Farmer. And he wrote the Fabius Letters. George Washington read the Fabius Letters, particularly Fabius 3. And in Fabius 3, that was the argument for the Constitution, he said this: the government of each state is and is to be sovereign and supreme in all matters that relate to each state only, and subordinate barely in those matters that relate to the whole, and it'll be their own faults if the several states suffer the federal sovereignty to interfere in the things of their jurisdiction. By the way, that's on that bookmark that's handed out to you. The excerpts from the Affordable Care Act case and some of these other quotes are on that. So this is just in putting this together, we formed a coordinating committee that involved the governor's office and the attorney general's office and our state school trust lands office, from our Association of Counties and our Farm Bureau and our recreation groups, and members, staff from our congressional delegation formed our coordinating committee. And again, our committee didn't start until the legislative session started. But we began to huddle up almost on a weekly basis, sometimes more when needed. And as the bill went forward, we refined and shaped the bill so that it took in the interests of Utah in putting that bill together. And so we had that team together. One of the things we put together was a website called Are We Not a State? The name for that website comes from 1857, when Dred Scott stood before the Supreme Court. And he held out his hands, and he asked the Supreme Court a question. And he said, "Am I not a man?" And in 1857, the Supreme Court said, "No, you're not." Imagine such a thing. No, you're not. But that wasn't the final word, or he would still not be a man. The states and the people said, "That's unacceptable. That makes no sense. Like that map makes no sense." And so the website is, Are We Not a State? On the website, we put all sorts of information. There's information on the American Lands Council website under the Resources tab. One of the things we put together was a little 60-second video that people could share and pass along and kind of teach these principles in a YouTube sort of way. And so I want to show you that now. And so very critical among our coordinating group was our education groups, our superintendents, our school districts association, PTA were supportive, the teachers union was supportive of the bill, because where do we go? As is already federal law under the Budget Control Act, you know, they kicked the can down the road 60 days, and so now March 1 is when, under federal law, 9% of federal discretionary spending is supposed to automatically go away. That's the sequestration. 10% of military spending is slated to go away under existing federal law. The best that we can hope for, if you talk to your members of Congress, I've been back there repeatedly to ask them about this, the best that you can hope for is we print more money and kick the can down the road a little bit longer, because there's no other solution to that. We're going to deal with these challenging things no matter how it shakes out, and so it's a wonderful time to be alive, isn't it? We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, as Ronald Reagan said in 1985. I would be happy to answer any questions. Let me tell you first, though, Nevada has a bill drafted and working forward. New Mexico has a bill drafted. It should be dropped maybe tomorrow or the next day. Congressman Pierce was speaking to a joint session last week in New Mexico and pointed out Representative Harrell and her bill and laid out this economic situation. He said, if you're waiting for solutions from Washington, you know, you're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. He says, you've got to own these problems. Washington's not going to solve the Washington problem, unfortunately. He says, and so he pointed out this bill and said, you need to step up. This is the only solution big enough to deal with what we have to deal with. Thank you so much for your time. I am grateful to be here. It is a very distinct honor. I wish I were on 40 acres growing carrots and raising chickens instead of doing this, but I'm very grateful for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Ivory, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate that. Committee, I'll open it for questions in just a moment. 3 o'clock, so we need to go to another committee, so feel free to leave. we have the room here, and we can remain and ask questions until 4 o'clock. So that's kind of the ground rules. Any questions for Mr. Ivory? Ken Andrus? Ken's got his mic on first, and we'll come to you, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ivory, for coming in this presentation. We've got the theoretical plan in place, but let's go to January 1st of 2015, when the federal government has not transferred the use to the states, and the states then go into the forest and cut trees and turn our livestock out, and President Obama comes in with his federal marshals and his National Guard. Is it inevitable then that that's what's going to happen? Because I don't see the federal government yielding right now, anyway.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman and Representative Andrus. We don't know. We don't know until we go down that road. Until Illinois and Indiana and Missouri and Alabama and Louisiana got together and presented that relentless front that refused to take no for an answer, they were making all sorts of statements about what if and what might, but because they were united and refused to take no for an answer, they prevailed upon Congress to transfer the lands. We've met with a number of members of Congress and leadership, and when we talk about this, they said, just like Congressman Pierce was saying to the joint session in New Mexico, we don't have an answer to these economic exigencies. And so there are trillions in resources in the Western lands, and we've got trillions in economic issues. You know, you unleash those resources, you unleash employment nationally, you grow GDP nationally, and you reduce debts and deficits nationally by growing taxpayers instead of raising taxes. And so they're seeing that. One thing I will tell you, that in the East, there are so many think tanks that are already targeting the public lands for some sort of disposition. That train has left the station. And so if we don't get in front of this and manage it, my guess is that if it's an Eastern resolution and we're not out in front with the solution, it's going to be something that doesn't work for our way of life. And so I don't know that we cross that bridge. In the legislation, what we put in place is it's a three-pronged approach. The first is educate and negotiate. We've got to educate first because people just don't know. I mean, it's really simple. It's already been done. The promises are the same. It's the only solution big enough. You have a card there that has the 10-second argument on it, right? I'll tell you just briefly, anecdotally, I was with our courts, you know, our Supreme Court, Appellate Court, District Court last week in our legislative day. They want to talk about their legislative priorities before our session starts. And we were talking, and one of them asked me, well, Representative Ivory, what sort of things are you working on? I said, well, I'm kind of busy on this lands thing, you know. And they said, oh, I just read an article about that, which is also in your packet. I just read an article about that by the president of Overstock.com. I just read an article about that the promises are the same and it's already been done before. This is the judge, my Supreme Court and Appellate Court judges. I just read an article about that. The promises are the same. It's already been done before. Wow, that makes this a really great case. As we educate and negotiate and band together, we can change that public opinion, particularly when they don't have solutions to the problems, and we do. Now, what we do then with our Public Lands Commission, charged under the legislation that you saw, is they're charged with coming up with the legal and jurisdictional actions that we will take if they don't dispose. And so we're going down that road, but we're not predetermining what that action is because we're hopeful for an orderly transition. But you know, we cross that bridge as we get there, and we start planning for the whole variety of measures that we may need to take. But our position is we're not going to take no for an answer. I mean, our kids are $2 billion a year below average. We're not taking no for an answer. So I hope that answers your question.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Ivory, this looks familiar to me under the CSG West Apple Initiative, the Action Plan for Public Lands and Education, which I'm very familiar with. Is this a child of that product, or did you guys work from that initiative?
It's kind of like the Incredible Hulk to the Apple Initiative. It's the Apple Initiative on steroids, we call it. Yes, it takes, yeah, Congressman Bishop has been very involved as we were going forward on this, and he was one of the main proponents and drivers, and he's incredible on this whole issue of public lands. And so, yes, that driving with that, because the Apple Initiative dealt with how the disparities in public education, and that really does drive a lot of this, because in our state budget, probably like yours, I mean, about 50% of our state budget is public education.
Follow-up, Mr. Chairman? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Ivory, now, the one thing I noticed, basically the transference would be, you would hold in trust through your endowments, I take it. Is there any ability to liquidate if they're non-public resource?
Right, so and let's be clear. So federal public lands become state public lands, separate and apart from the school trust lands. Those are already ours. We already manage them. We already administer them. And in our case, we do it very effectively and very well, except that we don't have access to many of our checkerboarded state lands. And when they come in and do other various federal policies like wilderness areas, they take hundreds of thousands of acres of school trust lands off the table and take money right out of classrooms. So those are separate. But so federal public lands become state public lands, multiple use, sustain, yield, local planning. But imagine, for example, you've got a ranch that has a pocket of BLM land in the middle of it. Makes sense to privatize that. So you go through a process, heightened scrutiny, heightened public notice, but you go through a process to liquidate those lands. Yes, perhaps you've got a city that's landlocked and the highest and best use is to allow that city to expand out. Well, yeah, again, you go through that public process, much like you would in vacating a park that's no longer useful as a park or a road that's no longer useful as a road. You have that process to go through that. But to be clear, this is not a liquidation act. It's federal public lands become state public lands because that's who we've become over, 117, 18, 120 years. And so we recognize that reality.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Ken. With the recent decision on Hawaii, was their Admissions Act substantially different than ours?
Yeah, theirs was quite a bit different, but the point of the Hawaii case was that Congress can't just unilaterally take action to change whatever that sovereign agreement was at statehood. So, for example, that's what the Federal Land Policy Management did. It was a policy unilaterally that changed these solemn compacts, the Supreme Court called it repeatedly, and it just changed that unilaterally. Now, in our enabling acts, it says that these things will not be changed. They say that it's an act irrevocable. This is the language right out of the document, that it's an act irrevocable without the consent of Congress and the people. And so going back on the three-prong, you've got educate, negotiate, legislate, and litigate. And so we're pursuing those three prongs simultaneously, and each one supports the other as we move forward.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Ivory, I'm sure you've probably done quite a bit of research on, I would think that initially there would be quite a cost for the state to administer these lands. Have you done any kind of research? Or?
Yeah, well, yes, and that's one of the things that, Representative, that we're working on going forward. This is why we don't draw a line in the sand right now. We put the deadline out several years because it is a measure twice, cut once approach. But let me give you just a couple of examples. Let's take North Dakota and Idaho, statehood at the same time. North Dakota gets 100% of its mineral lease monies. Idaho gets about 46, 47%. North Dakota gets to control access to its lands and its resources. Idaho, Utah, and others were severely restricted in what we can access. And then again, with the state trust lands, even the lands that we do own that we can access because they're shutting down roads all over the place. Our state institutional trust lands director estimates that alone, just access to the SITLA lands, the school trust lands that we already have, hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, there's a report that I can get to you, and I think I may have provided it to Speaker Denny. It's a report done a few years ago, turning a profit on federal forests. And it compares apples to apples, state management of forest with like-kind forest versus federal management of forest. And the disparities are just incredible in terms of revenue increased on the state side, decreased cost, increased profitability, and increased environmental quality of the lands versus federal management that's managed by an absentee landlord that doesn't have a vested interest on the ground in the land. And so I can make that available to you as well. But yes, we're doing a lot of those studies right now.
Mr. Ivory, I don't see another question. I have one. If we, let's just assume that in 2014, federal government says, Utah, here you go, take it over. Talk about how what kind of action that Utah takes from there, both
right,
money-wise, as management, et cetera.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. And so that was part of the process of the hearing that we had on September 19th in our Natural Resources Committee. We got all of our state land managers in and said, can we do this? And they said, of course we can do this. We have additional resource. Yes, we have additional responsibility, but we're going to be more efficient and more responsive. And so we're working through that. Now that's a short answer to a big question. There is definitely going to be a transition when we're 120 years getting into this. No one pretends that you can flip the switch and say, okay, now we're just going to, it's going to be great. No, there's going to be a tremendous transition. There's going to be growing pains. And also, we don't pretend that this is going to solve all the problems. You're going to still have grazing issues versus recreation issues versus mining issues versus hunting issues versus stream access. And, those issues are going to be out there, but we're going to be dealing with them in our backyard and amongst ourselves. And so that was when we talked to, the ranchers and the recreationists and the all the different interests on the lands as we pulled our coordinating committee together. That was kind of our overriding principle. Yes, we understand this isn't going to solve all the problems. Yes, we understand that there are still going to be maybe even tremendous concerns on how we work these things out. But would we rather do that ourselves in our own home than be dictated to? And the answer across the board on our land use people was, of course, we would. And so working on that going forward, yes, we've got a lot of, there's a lot to do between here and there. And so that's why we've got this Public Lands Commission to start reviewing and working through that. And that's what we're doing over the next 2 years. I think the Speaker Bedke made the comment. He says, you've kind of gone quiet. And I said, well, yeah, now we're doing the work. We passed the bill, and so now we're setting up the commission. Now we're doing the studies. Now we're looking at how we manage. Now we're looking at how the transition will happen and how that takes place. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work to happen between here and there. I would also say, and back to your point on some of the costs, organizations like the Federalist Society that commissioned this white paper, they have said we do lawsuits and litigation on things like this, and they have indicated that they've got funds to help in litigation. Now, this isn't a litigation bill, right? We talk about education, negotiation, legislation, and litigation as a three-pronged stool, but there are organizations that exist to help in things like this, and I forgot the other point, but
Mr. Ivory, I have one more. Was this a bipartisan effort in Utah, or was it?
Oh, thank you for the question. Yes, it was. Yes, we had. I mean, our House is predominantly Republican-controlled. Our Senate is predominantly Republican-controlled. But we had both sides co-sponsoring the bill. We had votes coming from both sides because, we understand we're all going to be in charge of educating our kids and going forward. We all understand that these problems are real. Reality is not negotiable. You can't print prosperity. Debt is not income. And somehow when you cross the Potomac, they've got a different law of economics, and these things are serious. These problems are serious, and 40% of every dollar that we spend comes from them. And so, no, looking at that, we understand that we're going to own these problems in our state, like it or not, and preparing to deal with it. We had support from, groups that don't normally play together, understanding that we've got to be in the same life raft, rowing the boat together.
Very good, thank you. I think you've stumped this committee, so maybe I'll ask if there's any question in the audience that would like to ask. Speaker Bedke over here.
Representative Ivory, how much blocking into the school system? Somebody has to include the bookends on thoughts that public schools in Utah?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Speaker Bedke and Mr. Chairman. There's still a lot of that work to go forward. Some of the low-hanging fruit, as we mentioned, we know that because we don't have access to our SITLA lands and access is being shut off and we can't even control and consolidate the lands that we do own, our director of state institutional trust lands, our school trust lands, says we're losing hundreds of millions of dollars there, just again in low-hanging fruit. We've got, you know, the issues of the 100% of the mineral royalties versus the 46%, and then the increased access, and the Government Accountability Office telling us that, you know, we have more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming than the rest of the world combined. And so the real hard number economic analysis is part of what's being done right now. And so we don't have the you know, direct figures to put onto that. That's part of what we're looking at going forward. But what we do know is we're $2 billion below average in per pupil funding now. We know that we would have to double income tax to close just the $2 billion gap, never mind that we're $5 billion out of 13 dependent on the federal government. Or we could increase corporate tax by 1,000% just to try to close the $2 billion gap. And so, you know, when people come up and say, let's tweak the tax code a little bit for education, in our case, you're just never going to get there that way. You're just not going to close that gap without completely killing the economy. And so we're confident that there's enough resource there. And so now we're going to really sharpen the pencil and put that economic analysis to that. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. The gentleman right here had a question.
Yes. You mentioned that it was not your intention to necessarily sell, you know, the public lands. But should you decide to, the decision is entirely up to the state of Utah.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And so federal public lands become state public lands, manage multiple use, sustain yield with local planning, and then the same process. If a city today were to decide to sell lands that are public in nature, streets, parks, what have you, they can do that. There's a heightened process, a heightened scrutiny, as there should be, to do that, but it's still possible. And then in that case, 5% of the proceeds go to the Permanent Fund for Education, 95% go to the federal government to reduce the debt.
The lady right down the row had a question. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Besides vote and just pay attention.
What a great question. What a great question. Thank you for that question, by the way. So let's think about our system. This is a republic of republics of republics, and all governments are instituted to secure the unalienable rights, right? That's the first job of government. Filling the potholes is necessary, but the first role of government is to secure those rights at every level. And so in your packet also is a resolution now that cities and counties and chambers of commerce and farm bureaus, in fact, your farm bureau has already done a resolution in support of this, I understand. But so there's a resolution in the packet, and we'll make that available to anyone that wants it. We have cities that have no public land that understand that this is a matter of education equality, and so they're passing resolutions saying we have to support this and move forward. So think about you trying to lift the world. That's a heavy lift. But if you combine with your family, that's still a heavy lift. But if you combine with your family and friends, you're still is a heavy lift. But if you get a jurisdiction, your city that now represents 10 or 20 or 30,000, to put their collective voice into this, now you're leveraging your ability. And then if you get to your county, and you get your county doing resolutions, and we have several counties doing resolutions to support the governor, and to support the attorney general, and to support the legislature, because that's a lonely place to be if you think about it. I mean, if you're a governor or attorney general, you're a team of one. As legislators, we have the convenience of being, I don't know your numbers, mine it's 104. So I have 75 team members that I can fall back into the trees, and I don't have to be conspicuous. When you're a governor or attorney general, you're a team of one out on the battlefield. And unless and until you know that the troops are there, and when the shots start flying, they're not going to just fall back into the trees, that's a difficult place to be. And so by doing this, you get these jurisdictional actors and chambers and cities and counties and organizations weighing in saying, Governor, we're going to be on that field of battle with you even when it gets hard. And so that's how you really start moving. And so that's the kinds of things that, you know, you can go to a city council with a resolution and say, please support this. In their packets, you have the op-eds from Jonathan Johnson, and, you know, other prominent people have done letters to the editor talking about different aspects of this, mayors and city managers talking about how it affects them, education people talking about how this would positively affect them. And then, you know, like I mentioned with the courts, I mean, we have our judges that seeing one op-ed and then finally considering the arguments. They hadn't seen this yet that you have. This just came out a few days ago. They hadn't even seen that yet, but one op-ed where they had someone make the legal case in 600 words saying the promises are the same, it's already been done before, and our judges, the light bulb went on and said, oh my gosh, what a strong case. So I hope that answers your question. That's the very nature of our system of government. We do have individual power through our increasing circles of jurisdiction, and we work there and work up.
The question right here. That row right there has got a lot of questions.
In keeping with what you were just talking about, kind of the coalition, clarify for us again what the Western state cooperative is looking like. We have 13 Western states with considerable federal land. A couple of them, can you update us? Are there others that are considered?
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The question was basically, well, how is the coalition shaping up in the other Western states? We're working as fast as we can. Unfortunately, my legislative salary is about $15,000 a year. I don't know what yours is, but that makes it a little difficult to, we don't have the $2 million staff like they do in Washington and other things in that way, but we're going as fast as we can. People have been very supportive of the American Lands Council. That was an organization that came about after this legislation. A number of county commissioners came in and said, you're going on offense. We want to do that with you. What do we do? And so that's, this American Lands Council formed as a group of jurisdictional actors with the support of individuals and businesses to secure land access, land use, land ownership. And so we have counties that are coming in and supporting a little bit, and individuals and businesses and others. That's allowing us to get forward a little bit. Been in New Mexico about 5 different times. I met with Governor Martinez last month for about 45 minutes. What an engaging lady. She was very encouraging. As I mentioned, they've got a bill coming out, and in a state like New Mexico, they've already got pretty good numbers. It's shaping up. They're having a legitimate discussion about this bill moving forward. We're very encouraged by what's happening in New Mexico. Nevada has a bill coming out within days. Arizona, the bill already passed their House and Senate, but their bill was a little bit different last year. And so their bill passed the House and Senate, and then it was vetoed by their governor. But their bill went to straight privatization. And as we've talked about, after 100 years where we've relied on hunting and fishing and ranching and mining and grazing, and that's who we are, that takes the rug right out from under our way of life. And so that bill was vetoed. The sponsors in Arizona are bringing the bill back in the form that we've done. And we've met with staff at Governor Brewer's office, and we're very encouraged with what's happening there. Obviously, we're very hopeful and encouraged by the support that we've seen in Idaho. Colorado, we have a great team on the ground working on the bill, but you know, politically, that's going to be that's going to take a lot of work. That's going to take a lot more of the education that we've talked about. And then, just from a matter of money and manpower, we've got some inroads into Wyoming and Montana. And unfortunately, I haven't really even been on the ground there yet. So we need to get there and educate and get moving. But we're hopeful that we may have some people that nevertheless may be sponsoring the bill there.
Further questions, Jim?
Chairman, Speaker, could I address you as a chairman and give you some perspective from a county position with why this is so important and what we just went through in Idaho County and what's going to be coming up?
Yeah, let's see if there's any other questions before we do that for Ken. Any other questions from the audience or from the committee that have? Ken, Representative Andrus, I'm sorry.
And Mr. Ivory, do you have a figure on what it would save taxpayers for Utah's share of administering BLM and Forest Service lands, or all of the federally controlled lands, not just Utah? Do you have a figure on either of those?
Yeah, I don't have specific numbers on that. I will get you the report on the, turning a profit on public forests, which was pretty analogous to the kinds of things you're dealing with in Idaho. There may even have been Idaho forests considered in the study. I'm not positive. I know there was Montana and Washington, but that would give you an example of the very stark difference in cost and profitability of state management versus federal management. And it really is stark. And so I'll get that report and make that available to you. But we don't have those specific numbers yet. Right now, what we're doing is formulating that kind of detailed economic analysis so that we can start to pinpoint. But it's a pretty big elephant to take down, and we're more than a few bites into it.
Got a question down here from Representative Raybould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ken, I'd like a little more clarity on the proceeds from this public land that would be turned over to the state. If I understood, you said if any of the land was sold, that 5% would go into the permanent fund for schools and 95% would go to the federal government for retirement of debt. What about revenues that comes in from, say, oil and gas leases, selling timber, grazing permits, and things like that? How would the state get enough money back to be able to manage those lands? In Idaho, we have an awful lot of timberland, and one big forest fire, and having to control that without federal assistance could eat up a big share of our budget. So how would you explain a little bit more on the revenues and how the state would come out on this?
Yeah, if you look at what we look to as a starting point for a model is our school trust lands. We're already managing millions of acres, as are you. We're already managing millions of acres quite effectively at the state level. And so you take that model and you expand it. Now the SITLA model, the school trust model for us, is purely income. This wouldn't be purely income because we would be looking at a multiple use model. But in terms of the income model, we would take that as a starting point and look at our school trust land model, which is managed profitably, and they deal with fires, and they deal with roads, and they deal with all the other issues on property, and yet still throw off a profit to turn out to the school children. So there certainly are the models and the things there that the other thing in terms of fires, if you look at on the website, I think it's quick fact number 4 on the front page of the American Lands Council website. It says who can manage these lands. Forest Service and GAO, Government Accountability Office, own documents say we're loving the forest to death under federal management. These policies, these preservationist policies have failed the test of time, where you get beetle kill going through a forest and you still can't touch a tree. You get 1,000 trees per acre, and so where you're actively managing the forest, the fire risk goes down. In fact, I was talking to, he left now. I guess I can pick on him since he's gone. But Speaker Bedke was talking about the example that you have right here in Idaho on one side or the other of Priest Lake, and monitoring the lightning strikes of one side of Priest Lake versus the federal side of Priest Lake, and the incidence of fire and the size of fire are just dramatically different because one side is managed and the other is not. I hope that answers your question.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up, the thing that I see, though, is if on our state lands, if our state land department sells some of those lands, we get the money. We don't send 95% of it to the federal government to pay off a debt. Right. We can sell that land. We can trade it for other land. We can sell it and use the money to go into to finance some other business or something. And so that kind of worries me, what you're talking about of us taking over management of the land and then turn around after we sell it and give 95% of it back to the federal government.
Yeah, and so in the SITLA model, they're not selling lands. They're retaining them, and they're managing and leasing and operating those lands, and they do it very profitably. And so, but again, I'm not here to prescribe to Idaho what's best for Idaho. We're presenting a model, and you may choose that you want to do more privatization, but that's certainly, that's something that this body is charged with doing, and so it certainly isn't my prerogative to prescribe what you all may choose to do with your own control of your own lands.
We have a question down here, Mr. Ivory. Sit away.
Thank you, Representative Ivy. I support your effort, and I love what you're doing. When we do comparisons with one state to another, as far as what's being brought in from, say, livestock grazing on the public lands, I think Utah and Idaho are fairly similar in what they're getting for an AUM. When you ran your pro forma on your income or on your expected revenues, did you use the same revenues that you're currently getting from state grazing leases, or did you modify that to reflect the cost of what an AUM is at the federal level now?
Yeah, animal unit month, right? Is that what? So we had long discussions with our Farm Bureau and our cattlemen's and sheep growers on this. And yeah, there's going to be adjustments going forward, likely, we anticipate. But what we anticipate with a greater state control is greater services, greater access, greater consistency that has a higher value to those that are on the land grazing. For example, I'll give you just an example that we're dealing with right now, and you may be dealing with it here. There's a Forest Service memo out that talks about an intention to take over the water throughout the public lands. What we're seeing with grazers on the land is that the Forest Service and BLM are coming in and telling our grazers that they're not going to renew their permits at all unless they sign over their water to the United States. We're hearing that in other western states as well, and so you're in a situation where the burden put upon the grazers, they're seeing that in the discussions that we had, was we would much rather have a state managed grazing that may even be a higher cost on the AUMs than deal with the tremendous uncertainty that we're dealing with now, again, with an absentee landlord. As far as getting down into greater detail on those revenue models, again, that's what this next year is all about. And so while it may look like we're, from the outside, we're not out beating the drum, that's because we're sharpening the pencil and we're going to work on how do we build these models. And so that's the kind of stuff we're working on now.
Thank you. And a follow-up, please.
Go ahead, Senator.
And maybe just a comment on, on that. If there isn't, I think most of the grazers in the state of Idaho that graze state lands, we receive a bill for the grazing of those lands, and I would venture to guess that most of us think that we're buying some grass, and then with most of the money that we're paying to the state, it's just an endowment to our school system. It's not really for a value of the grass. It's just that's part of the cost of doing business on that that piece of ground. But the other question I had was disposition of that land, and if there were any concerns or any detail in how you go about that disposition. I can see where the lands that have valuable resources for housing and recreation, of some developed recreation, may have high enough values to see that there may be some lease or rental rate or some option to buy or something where the state may benefit. But I would think that if the schools were really going to benefit, you would have to get those lands on the tax rolls. And did you go into that kind of detail about getting those lands on a tax roll so that those lands could be taxed and the income go directly to the schools in those local taxing districts?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Mr. Chair, yes, we did consider that deeply. Obviously, food and our ability to have people on the ground producing food is a tremendous fundamental priority. We're already doing that in how we manage state lands under a school trust land model. Under our school trust lands, we don't get to cherry pick the lands. We have good lands and bad lands and energy lands and grazing lands and lands that, quite frankly, aren't worth much at all. And yet, all of those lands are managed under the school trust scenario. Some are, a large number are grazing, others are other forms of revenue. And so, looking at that kind of model, we're looking at that same sort of thing where we keep the land productive at the highest multiple use, where we can still try to accommodate to the greatest extent possible the, the various multiple uses that were out there. And so grazing is a critical part of that use. I mean, that's something that we had extensive discussions, and our ranching, farming, grazing community were part of our coordinating group to make that happen. I don't know if I'm speaking directly to your question or not.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. You know, quite frankly, the income from grazing in the state of Idaho is just barely a break even for the state land board. So, you know, but it's a vast, vast majority of the land owned by the state is grazing land, and that's the only use for it. So,
right, exactly right.
So if, you know, if we're looking for income for the schools off grazing land, we're just beating our head against a concrete wall.
Right,
but
and so that's
if we
where
sell those lands, then we can make some money.
Right, and so that's where you come back to this concept of multiple use. Right, you've got Commissioner Schmelik, actually, I saw in an op-ed that he did, talked about the loss of revenue, and he'd probably be better to speak to this, but in Idaho County, just from the fire that ravaged through Idaho County, what would be traditionally the 25% in the SRS monies that would come back to Idaho County was, I don't know, he could probably speak to that, it was millions of dollars that just was burned up. I mean, it was just burned up. And so where in a state model where you're controlling the lands throughout the state, you've got some very rich mineral lands and forest lands and others that would be more income producing. You've got other lands that, again, food is a priority. It may not be that they're there purely for income, but that's a priority. And as you say, that may be the highest and best use. That's the best you're going to do on those lands. So, yeah, certainly that analysis of multiple use was very much in the calculus of how we put this together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We wouldn't have to monkey around with those rascally EISs either, would we?
Right. Yeah, you know, on that point, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Where the state owns and controls the lands, the equal access to justice would not necessarily apply because it's not federal land. And so to the extent that you're looking at lawsuits that stop activity and various things that go forward, you know, groups that may be of a mind to do that would have to do it on their own dollar instead of doing it on the federal public treasury through the equal access to justice.
Okay. I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you very much. Very kind of you to come and bring us up to speed on that.
What a great honor. Thank you.